Few words in 20th century history have been as complicated as Bolshevik. The Bolsheviks were a splinter group of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party and became a formal party in 1912. They were avowed Marxists and revolutionaries who spearheaded the Russian Revolution in 1917, toppling the Tsar and giving rise to the Soviet Union. They would later rename themselves as the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, although the Bolshevik nickname still stuck. For decades, the Bolsheviks ruled one of the most powerful countries on earth, endured a world war, and became locked in a decades-long ideological standoff with the capitalist world. The Bolsheviks fell in 1991, and the USSR along with them, but in the years since, the legacy of their rule has been increasingly scrutinized. How much did the rosy propaganda of the USSR align with reality? What truths were revealed when the archives were opened? What diabolical things did the Bolsheviks do during the reign? Today, we explore the dark deeds of the ruling party of the Soviet Union. From the outset, the Bolsheviks were possessed by ideology. They preached a form of revolutionary Marxism that scorned private property and land ownership. They detested capitalism, monarchism, nationalism, and religion as tools of powerful groups to control the masses, and instead believed that all of these things should be overthrown and replaced with a system of collective ownership for the benefit of the workers. The ideal Bolshevik future was one where everyone was equal in wealth and legal status, living in a world free from poverty, war, and oppression. It was an inspiring vision that had long appealed to many, and continues to inspire people today. Advanced by articulate and intelligent thinkers, most notably Vladimir Lenin, Soviet-style Marxism gained traction in the early years of the 20th century. However noble its goals may have been, even in these early years, the Bolsheviks showed that they were perfectly willing to sacrifice human lives on the altar of their ideology. For example, one of the ways that the Bolsheviks raised money in the 1900s was through robbery. This robbery often harmed the very people the Bolsheviks claimed to be protecting. In June 1907, in the Georgian city of Tiflis, a group of Bolsheviks ambushed a shipment of cash in the town's Erevansky Square with firearms and explosives. In the ensuing violence, around 40 people were killed, many of them civilians. The robbery caused mass outrage against the Bolsheviks, and many of the Bolsheviks' leaders involved in the robbery, most notably Lenin and Stalin, later attempted to cover up their associations with the event. In the grand scheme of history, 40 deaths would be a mere drop in the ocean of what the Bolsheviks would go on to do, but it was a chilling forewarning of what was to come. By 1917, the memory of the robbery had faded. The Bolsheviks had become a potent force for Marxist revolution amidst a Russia locked in the grueling First World War. It was the Bolsheviks that lit the revolutionary spark that burned down the Tsarist regime in 1917, and eventually inaugurated the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR. It was the first socialist state in history, and it would be christened in blood. In July 1918, the deposed Tsar Nicholas II, along with his family, including his 13-year-old son, were executed by Bolshevik forces in an act that remains deeply controversial to this day. The Russian Civil War erupted as countless factions sought to oppose the new regime. For all of its claims of protecting the Russian people, the Bolsheviks plunged the country into one of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century. By the end of the fighting in 1923, at least 7 million Russians had been killed, with some estimates putting the number closer to 12 million. While fighting the war, the Bolsheviks also had to tighten their grip on the areas they already controlled. Ideological enemies had to be rooted out, and so, in the opening years of Bolshevik rule, tens of thousands of people were killed in a campaign of repression and extermination known as the Red Terror. The Cheka, the newly founded Bolshevik secret police and forerunner of the more famous KGB, played a leading role in hunting down all those designated as enemies of the state. Pre-revolution officials, Tsarists, anti-communists, landowners, business owners, priests, and almost anyone who might have a reason to oppose the new regime found themselves in its sights. For the revolution to be successful, all counter-revolutionary elements had to be eliminated. Historians estimate that around 100,000 people were murdered by the Bolsheviks in the first 5 years of the regime. Far from shame, the Bolsheviks' leaders felt pride. Grigory Zioniev, one of the leading Bolsheviks at the time, captured the attitude of the regime towards any that stood in its way. We must carry along with us 90 million out of the 100 million of Soviet Russia's population. As for the rest, we have nothing to say to them. They must be annihilated. The Bolsheviks had a goal, and no amount of human suffering was too much in the pursuit of utopia. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had eliminated all effective opposition and stood unrivaled as the masters of Russia. In December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics (USSR) was formed. Under various names, the Bolsheviks would remain at its head until its collapse almost 70 years later. Having established their power, the Bolsheviks now set out to build their communist ideal. One of the most important steps towards this was the collectivization of agricultural land. This meant taking farmland out of private hands and placing it under the control of the people as represented by the state. The goal was to avoid the profit-seeking of private landowners and the unequal distribution of food in a private system. Instead, the government would take control of agriculture. It was argued that the collectivization would ensure that agriculture worked for the benefit of everyone and would allow the state to distribute food equally among its people. Collectivization remains a touchy political issue, and the jury is out on whether it could ever work. It is still a goal proposed around the world today. However, the massive death tolls from the Bolsheviks' attempts to implement it, along with similarly disastrous consequences in places like China and Cambodia, cast a grim shadow over the debate. Lofty goals were one thing, but real-world results were another. Many peasants refused to give up their land, and in response, the Bolsheviks employed force. Any who resisted collectivization were named as enemies of the Soviet Union, of communism, and of society as a whole. Rural social structures were torn apart as the Bolsheviks tried to remake Russia to fit its new vision. Peasants who resisted found themselves threatened, abused, imprisoned, or killed. Institutions such as the Orthodox Church became focal points for peasant resistance. Thousands of Orthodox clergy were imprisoned or executed, and by 1940, over 90% of Russia's Orthodox priests had been eliminated. In 1937 alone, over 85,000 priests were executed. One of the main victims of the collectivization process were the gulags. Gulag was a term referring to a land-owning peasant, but in reality, it referred to anyone deemed to have more than the Bolshevik authorities thought they deserved. Farmers who could afford to hire farmhands who owned more than a small plot of land or who owned too many animals might be labeled as gulags. The Bolsheviks designated these people as class traitors and enemies of the revolution. In the zero-sum worldview of the Bolsheviks, the supposed wealth of the gulags could only have been stolen from the people. Many of these gulags were actually quite poor, and few even approached the level of the middle class, but nevertheless the Bolsheviks marked them out for destruction. Their property was seized and millions were imprisoned or forced off of their land. Hundreds of thousands were simply murdered. Not only did the gulags themselves suffer, but the death of so many productive agricultural workers produced a predictable outcome: famine. The Soviet famines of the 1930s were a direct result of Bolshevik policy and led to the death of millions of people. Nowhere were the effects of collectivization and man-made famine seen more terribly than Ukraine. Ukraine had a high population of gulags. Although part of the USSR, Ukraine also had a strong independence movement that resisted Soviet control. Over 4,000 instances of Ukrainian resistance to Soviet collectivization were recorded in the years leading up to the famine. And in the 1930s, Stalin saw a chance to remove nationalists and kulaks at once. A suite of policies were introduced to break Ukrainian resistance and seize the property of citizens. Ukrainian political, cultural, and religious leaders were imprisoned or executed. Those designated as kulaks were forcibly removed from their land, and the state engaged in massive seizure of green resources. The actions were justified with appeals to the Bolsheviks' political program. Leo Kopelev, then a radio news broadcaster but later a renowned anti-Soviet author and activist, reflected on how those complicit in the events saw things. "I was among those who believed that you had to shake up the village to get it to give up the grain, that the villagers, kulaks, had no consciousness of awareness, that they care only about their property, that they don't care for the workers, that they are not interested in the construction of socialism." One resident of Mariupol, cited in Anne Applebaum's book Red Famine 2017, similarly recalled how ideology was used to justify abuse. They recounted the story of a shopkeeper who became enraged at a starving Ukrainian teenage girl and kicked her to death in the street. An avowed supporter of the regime, the shopkeeper supposedly told weeping and horrified onlookers that the girl and those like her were enemies of the people, who deserved no sympathy. By dressing up their actions with ideological ideals, the Bolsheviks justified their actions for a supposed greater good, that even if it succeeded, millions would not live to see. Predictably, the decimation of the most productive agricultural land in the USSR and the extermination of its most productive farmers produced a famine. Far from trying to relieve it, Stalin and the Bolshevik authorities intentionally exacerbated the problem. Ukrainians who dared to steal state-controlled grain were inflicted with harsh punishments, and strict internal travel controls were implemented that prevented refugees fleeing the worst-hit areas, trapping them in the worst-affected regions of the country. The man-made famine in Ukraine in 1932 and 1933 is now known as the Holodomor. Estimates for the death toll range from 3.5 to 7 million people killed in just 2 years. Not only was the famine a direct outcome of Bolshevik actions, the government intentionally acted to worsen the famine in order to eliminate Ukrainians. Although the label is debated, the Holodomor has been named a genocide by both the European Parliament and the Ukrainian government. The scars of the Holodomor continue to shape Ukraine to this day, and linger in national memory as a symbol of Russia's historic abuses towards the nation, a precedent that recent history has chillingly followed. Not every victim of the Bolshevik regime was immediately killed. One of the most infamous tools employed by Stalin was the Gulag System. The Gulags were a massive collection of prisons and forced labor camps that millions of Soviet citizens were subjected to between the 1930s and 1950s. The Gulags received traditional criminals like murderers and rapists, but it also received political prisoners. Anyone who was even suspected of opposing the regime, no matter how thin the evidence, could find themselves carted off to the gulags. The Gulag System created a climate of fear and suspicion in Soviet society. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens became informants for the secret police, some hoping to ingratiate themselves with the authorities by ratting out friends and neighbors, but others possessed by a genuine ideological zeal to find supposed enemies of the people. Since almost any offense could earn a sentence, and any person could be an informant, Soviet citizens became trapped in a constant web of fear and performative loyalty. The Gulag System was never a secret, but its true horrors were exposed most famously by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his historic book The Gulag Archipelago, 1973. In the book, Solzhenitsyn describes the origins of the system and recounts his experiences during his 8 years of imprisonment within it. Solzhenitsyn was arrested in 1945 for writing derogatory comments about Stalin in a private letter to a friend. Even such a minor transgression was enough to earn Solzhenitsyn almost a decade of suffering inside the camps. Solzhenitsyn gives insight into the grueling lives of those who crossed the Soviet regime. Almost all of the gulags were forced labor systems where prisoners worked long days on difficult work. Most of the camps were far from civilization, often in the frigid wastelands of Siberia, which meant that working conditions were often deadly. The conditions were akin to slavery, and all sorts of abuse was inherent in the system. For example, Solzhenitsyn describes the systematic abuse of female prisoners, who were ordered to line up, strip naked, and be paraded in front of Gulag officials, so they could select which prisoners to keep as sex slaves. Of all of the sufferings that Gulag prisoners endured, one of the most consistent problems remembered by inmates was hunger. The food ration for Gulag prisoners was barely enough to keep them as functional workers, and the withholding of food was a common punishment. The quality of the food was extremely poor, with bread often being made with sawdust. Still, the food the prisoners did get was precious to them. Solzhenitsyn reflected on how desperation turned the miserable Gulag rations into a blessing. You had to eat with all your thoughts on the food, like he was nibbling off these little bits now, and turn them over on your tongue, and roll them over in your mouth, and then it tasted so good, this soggy black bread. Starvation and malnutrition claimed many lives among the prisoners. Disease claimed others in the unsanitary conditions of the camp, or exposure took them in the frigid Siberian wastes. Others died from work injuries, and executions were regularly employed for troublesome prisoners. The death toll from the gulags has been a subject of debate. Although the gulags were not extermination camps like those of the Nazis, at least 1 million people still died during or shortly after their internment, with some estimates putting the number as high as 3 million. A consensus is starting to emerge of about 1.5 million deaths, but this is by no means a final number. For millions more, the physical and mental scars of the camps would remain for life. The Gulag system proved too cruel for Stalin's successors. Later Soviet rulers denounced the system and began dismantling it, but some critics point out that many of the methods, practices, and even locations of the gulags remained in use for years, even decades after their formal abolition. No video could ever hope to cover every diabolical thing done by the Bolsheviks. Chances are that many of you can think of events that we haven't covered. The Katyn massacre, massacres of civilians during the invasion of Finland, and forced deportation to Siberia, to name just a few, which only goes to show the scale of the atrocities committed during their reign. Similarly, no definitive death toll for the actions of the Bolsheviks can truly be known, but historians estimate that the number of people killed as a direct or indirect result of the Soviet regime is in the tens of millions. These atrocities were enabled by ideological possession that placed the goals of the regime above the lives of actual human beings. Similarly to Nazi Germany or Fascist Italy, a government enchanted by its own vision of what the future should look like turned the present into an unimaginable hell for countless victims. The atrocities of the Bolsheviks exposed millions to some of the worst cruelty mankind could offer. Solzhenitsyn, like so many others, spent years attempting to understand why. How could anyone partake in such a brutal system? Solzhenitsyn, like many people and world religions, came to believe that the sort of evil unleashed by the Bolsheviks was not some unique product of Bolshevism, of communism, or of Russians, but indicative of an evil within all of us. The line between good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. Ideology, be it communism, fascism, or any other system, fueled the evil that lies within every human heart. Possessed by their ideology, the Bolsheviks inflicted uncountable evils on their fellow man. Even now, decades after they fell, the legacy of their diabolical actions remains. Today's video is quite grim, but it reminds us why we all need to learn from history. History is the collective experience of billions of human beings that came before us. By studying it, we can hope to retain some of the lessons and avoid some of the mistakes that our predecessors made. If you want to learn from history alongside us, then please subscribe for more videos like this one, and like this video to show your support.